used to hang out. Well, he is an all-pro,
all linebacker.
He is an all-star, that's for sure. You know, you would have gotten a big kick out of some of the earlier ones, though, where they had like troops of these guys coming, walking, and I mean, it was sort of like the full brigade, right?
Like when the Lubavitcher Rebbe goes someplace.
Yes.
Before and the after.
Yes, exactly. But the good news is that he's, you know, as I said, he's a real genuine.
Yeah, he seems, you can see in his face.
Yeah, it's very down to earth.
I mean, he's doing the formal stuff, but he's not wedded to it. It's not who he is.
Exactly.
Special chair.
Exactly. Yeah, sometimes you wonder if you can almost stand that. You know, he's that kind of person.
Right.
Thank you. Sure.
Like, as if you have that kind of position, you don't want to squander the symbolic capital.
This is true.
I mean, okay, so they call me a professor, right? I'd like to be called professor, and you too.
Yeah. Welcome, Your All Holiness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We are pleased to have this panel this afternoon. Can religions help to save the planet? It's a big question. We might say they can do it in the spirit of this conference in dialogue with science and with policy and economics. But certainly that dialogue has been the spirit of this conference, these symposiums, and we are very pleased to begin with the Lord Bishop of London, Dr. Richard Chartres, who has been part of this symposium from the very beginning and is leading a variety of initiatives, including the ecological footprint, and maybe his most distinguished commitment was to not fly for 18 months, which had a great deal of attention. But please join me in welcoming the Bishop of London. Thank you.
Your All Holiness, Eminences, friends, I just wanted to begin, and I shall be very strict with time, because I think you're directing us to not exceed
20 minutes.
20 minutes, yes. Unfortunately, bishops very early on in their career develop the fatal facility for continuous utterance. So we must be very careful about that. And in fact, there's a rev counter in front of me, so I shall try and adhere to that. I was very interested by some of the statements and some of the material we heard this morning, and interested in a conversation afterwards with somebody who's now departed, but who described a story in 3 generations. He said he was utterly committed and loyal to the church because it had meant everything to his mother. His mother had received huge blessings from her membership of the church, and for her it was what gave meaning and spice to life. He was totally committed on the basis of his mother's profound engagement. And then he thought about his own children. 4 children utterly committed to the environmental cause, extremely serious about it, and children who could not understand what relevance the church and the Christian faith in particular had for their very passionate commitment to saving the future of the planet. And that in some ways is our challenge, because there's no shortage of ideas. And in fact, at an earlier stage in the environmental movement, you used to go to conference after conference in which people used to compete with one another to reveal how green were my scriptures, of whatever kind they might be. The crucial thing is, of course, that energies are incubated in a transforming community of the future. And the Church was called upon to be a transforming community of the future. And it therefore could not be more significant that in this initiative, His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, has continually built bridges between that essential characteristic of the Church, that it should be a transforming community of the eschatological future, with some of the great challenges that face the whole human race. It's not only, or perhaps even not primarily, in the field of ideas that there is a possibility that the religious bodies of the world, and I'm obviously speaking from very partial knowledge of just a part, there is a very considerable hope that such bodies, if they recover profoundly their character as transforming communities of the future, will be enabled to enlarge the room for maneuver so that politicians in a democratic society can actually take the kind of initiatives which are necessary, but which at the moment they judge to be electoral suicide. And this morning we heard that one of the problems of this whole area was the problem of democracy and the fact that you cannot go too far beyond public opinion if you're in public office. And indeed, your horizon is bound to be fairly short-termist. It's bound to be the next election. So what are the churches doing to enlarge the room for maneuver so that sympathetic politicians can take the action that we all know is necessary? Our French friend was talking about the action necessary in terms of a benign and encouraging tax regime and regulatory regime. That is obviously in the sphere of political action, which is not our business, although I am a member of Parliament in clear defiance of the principle of laïcité. But nevertheless, how can we, as transforming communities of the future, really enlarge this room for maneuver so that sympathetic politicians can act? And sometimes those in the churches are in denial about how far we have very often diverged from what is a matter of passion for so many young people. Denial, of course, we are familiar with that in terms of climate change, but I think there can also be denial among some of the world's religious bodies as they look at their actual performance. As Al Gore, who's already been quoted in this symposium, as Al Gore said memorably, denial, it's not just a river in Egypt. And it's certainly something which we all have to be very aware of. But I think one of the contributions perhaps we have to make is to combat the current climate of doom. There was a very remarkable exchange at the end of the summer, and you can read this exchange on the website of the Guardian newspaper in the UK, between two of those who've spent years contemplating the likely outcomes of our present environmental degradation. Paul Kingsnorth and George Monbiot. Paul Kingsnorth says, the civilization we are part of is hitting the buffers at full speed. It's too late to stop it. The writing is on the wall for industrial society. No amount of ethical shopping or determined protesting is going to change that now. The challenge is not how to shore up crumbling empire with wave machines and global summits, but to start thinking how we're going to live through the fall of this present civilization and what we can learn from its collapse. And George Monbiot, in reply, said, like you, I've become ever gloomier about our chances of avoiding the crash you predict. For the past few years, I've been almost professionally optimistic, exhorting people to keep fighting, knowing that to say there is no hope is to make it so. I still have some faith in our ability to make rational decisions based on evidence, but it is waning. And in response to this rather bleak and grim view, it's interesting that Paul Kingsnorth has launched a so-called Dark Mountain project based on 8 so-called principles of uncivilization, which include at points 2 and 3, we reject the faith which holds that the converging crises of our times can be reduced to a set of problems in need of technological or political solutions. We believe that the roots of these crises lie in the stories we've been telling ourselves. We intend to challenge the stories which underpin our civilization, the myth of progress, the myth of human centrality, and the myth of our separation from nature. These myths are more dangerous for the fact that we have forgotten that they are myths. And so he hopes to form a community, because it's only when we have that kind of energizing passion held in common that we can generate the energy appropriate to the challenge we all face. But it is only too easy to get locked into a competitive auction of doom. And I think that there are, in fact, problems, and we heard some of them this morning, that can be solved by technological and political action. But at the same time, there is a real sense in which our awareness, not so much our ideas, because one of the problems is, how do you translate notions, ethics, into an ethos? How do you translate theory into an awareness which actually transforms one's way of being in the world? Everybody knows, and some of the facts were rehearsed this morning very eloquently, everybody knows about some of the perils which face us. I've been particularly interested recently in rubbish. Bishops are constantly accused of talking rubbish, but actually I recently gave a whole lecture on rubbish. I was fascinated to discover that rubbish, which of course is as old as life itself, is something else which we owe to the ancient Greeks. The Greeks gave us science, they gave us philosophy, they gave us the tragic drama, they gave us history, and the ancient Greeks also gave us the beginnings of the recorded history of municipal rubbish collection. The authorities in classical Athens established a rubbish dump a mile outside the city walls. It was the very first example of such a sane proceeding. So we know about the perils which face us. We know about the rubbish which is now so great in our junk throwaway culture that we in the UK, for instance, we waste £10 billion worth of food every single year, a third of what we buy. And the rubbish is so great that this symposium has always been concerned with the fate of the seas. And we now know that the biggest landfill site of all is, alas, in the Pacific Ocean, where a continent of plastic soup, the eastern and western garbage patches, cover an area equal to that of the United States. The perils, but also the promise of this century, have been vividly presented to us in 2 symbols. And this is to echo something that was said this morning in your film, Mary. These symbols have been revealed to the generations born after the Second World War and to no previous generations in the same way. And the symbols are the cloud and the globe. We use signs to represent what we consciously want to communicate, but a symbol is something beyond that. It's a communication from beyond our own conscious capacities. Symbols emerge rather like the hand from the lake in the story of King Arthur holding the sword Excalibur. And symbols are rarely univocal. They suggest truths which lie beyond us by assembling, because as we know, the Greek root of the word symbol is symbalein, throwing together fragments of reality which are commonly only perceived in isolation or even in opposition. And the cloud which haunts our world is obviously, first of all, the mushroom cloud, which followed on our success in splitting the atom, but we also live in a cloud of potential, in the cloud in cyberspace. And one of the most remarkable things about our own time is the switch to cloud-based services. It's just one of the innovations which is opening up possibilities of ever more rapid and inexpensive communication in our wireless but interconnected world. The challenge of the 21st century is to develop the wisdom to use the power of the cloud, to use the powers which the knowledge and the discoveries of the 20th century have bequeathed to us. And we heard a great deal this morning about the contrast between wisdom and knowledge, and I have much to say about that, but you cannot bear it now. The other symbol is the globe. The cloud and the globe, seen sapphire blue and beautiful, and photographed for the very first time from outer space on Christmas Eve 1968. And the promise of that symbol is of a global consciousness which embraces all living beings and the whole earth in compassion and neighbor love. The peril, of course, lies in the ambitions of those who are wealthy and powerful now to entrench a global hegemony forever. So in this world dominated by the cloud and the globe, both of which have peril, but both of which also have promise, the great thing is to work at building up a community that is a genuinely transforming community of the future. And I think that our historic Christian culture, which is the only one I'm even superficially qualified to talk about, has some very profound resources indeed for doing just that. We've been talking about balance and the return to balance, and we've been doing it in a city where perhaps we also ought to be talking about balance and rhythm, because it's all around us. But the Christian ascetic way, you cannot translate ethics and ideas into ethos and awareness without practice. This is a bizarre civilization, ours, in which people believe they can have access to wisdom without the spiritual development which actually brings things into perspective and creates the possibility of some kind of holistic awareness. And the spiritual practice of the Christian Church is one of Eucharistic ascesis. This is not getting measured for a hair shirt with a grim perception of some doom-laden horizon. This is fasting for joy. This is fasting balanced with feasting, because we know that carnival with no ensuing Lent merely leads to sickness. This is Eucharistic ascesis with its foundation in thanksgiving. This is a life which is not taken for granted, but is referred to the author and being the author and source of all life. It's taken with thanksgiving. It's taken in a Eucharistic spirit, which means that we may enter the community, the transforming community of the future, for its characteristic act, with the sense that Descartes said he was anxious to impart to human beings, which is that they should be masters and possessors of the earth. We may enter into the Eucharist in that kind of spirit, and it is in the Eucharist that we discover that we are not masters and possessors of the earth. We are, in fact, guests, stewards, viceroys, charged with fulfilling that balance which is adumbrated for us in Genesis 2. We are to till and keep the earth. We're not to refrain from development, but we are to keep it in balance with proper respect, reverence, and conservation. I frequently have a dream, and it may be because His All Holiness has introduced me to the theme of the great waters of the planet, but I frequently have a dream of sculling in a very frail craft on a vast body of swiftly moving water. The banks on either side are rather indistinct, so great is the flood, not unlike the Mississippi at some points. And I can see the way we've come, but the future is flowing from behind my back into view. I'm rowing with the current, and there is a sense of some great and undisclosed ocean to which we are being carried. I believe passionately that if we can profoundly, through prayer, through Eucharistic ascesis, if we can profoundly align ourselves with the deep currents in this great stream, then there is peril, but there is above all huge promise of immense freedom and fruitfulness. The saddest words in any language are these: it's too late. But contrary to the prophets of doom, it may be that the night is far spent, but the day is at hand. Now, we are all trying in a very practical way to assemble a coalition of people of goodwill to learn profoundly from what science has to teach us. Science, to me, provides the material for doxology, for glory, for celebration. There is no better way than looking through microscopes and telescopes than to actually write new poetry, create new hymns to the glory of God. So learning from our colleagues with profound humility, because I think that in many ways scientists have succeeded in creating a wholesome global conversation about these things to a much greater extent than so-called spiritual people. But learning from them, I am so grateful that we've been drawn together on this 8th occasion to intensify our passion, to build up this coalition, particularly now at this very crucial point, just in advance of the Copenhagen summit. The Secretary General of the UN is coming to a conference of the world's religions at Windsor as part of his preparation for Copenhagen. And I think that the fruits of this conference are going to be one of the most important streams to flow in to that particular consultation. So, with 43 seconds to go, I thank you very much indeed for your kindness and attention.
Thank you so much, Bishop, for those wonderful comments and your delightful humor. Our next speaker is Cardinal McCarrick from Washington, D.C., most recently remembered by many of us, as my husband just mentioned, for doing a beautiful prayer service for Senator Kennedy at the very moving whole day. But at the very end, in the dark, Cardinal McCarrick said some beautiful words. He is, among many things, on a number of pontifical commissions: the Commission of Justice and Peace, the Commission for Pastoral Care of Migrants, the Commission for Latin America. His worldwide commitment to human rights is known around the world, and religious freedom. Please join me in welcoming Cardinal McCarrick.
Well, Holiness, my dear sisters and brothers, as soon as I saw the program that put me right after His Lordship, I knew it was all over. Because he said everything and has said it so well. And he has a skill which must come from being Lord Bishop of London, but he has made it more acute and more excellent, and we so much enjoy everything that he says, and the courage and the brilliance with which he says it. So, first of all, may I express my own very deep honor to be involved once again in this very important and historic series of meetings and discussions on what is truly the future of our planet. I'm grateful for the opportunity of being here once again with new friends and old friends to discuss the future of our world. As an American, I'm glad that we've come to these waters, where so much of our history has been played, and so much of the life of Middle America is fed by this river, and by the great tributaries up and down the spine of our country. I'm grateful as always to His Royal Holiness, Patriarch Bartholomew, for the invitation to be with you again. His Royal Holiness is one of my heroes in so many ways over the years, and indeed now in a very special way for his role in being the great champion of courage and wisdom in the pursuit of ecological changes in our societies that may help us to preserve the great gift of God's creation. I note with great joy that His Holiness Pope Benedict had asked a dear friend of mine, the new Archbishop of New Orleans, who was with us this morning, to be his personal representative at this gathering. Archbishop Aymond, I wish he were here to let me say these things about him, is a son of New Orleans and the first native son to be a shepherd. His appointment was greeted with extraordinary happiness by the people in this part of our country who rejoice that his pastoral zeal and his loving care will be a great blessing to this wounded city and a torch of hope for the people who live here for the next many years. After the adventures of a couple of years ago in the Arctic Ocean, All Holiness, it is nice to be in a more convenient climate and on waters which are not tending to such rigor and enthusiasm as the waters of that great sea. I came prepared, as you may recall, for that journey in the Arctic Ocean with many brands of seasick pills. Thank God I did not need them, but thank God I had them, since some of my colleagues used up my entire supply during the rigors of that journey. I want to express to all the associates of His Royal Holiness, whose thoughtfulness and brilliance, especially to Metropolitan John, whose thoughtfulness and brilliance have always been a great guide to this work, and in a very personal way to Dr. Maria Beckett, without whose help it would be impossible to bring such a distinguished group together in so wonderful an environment and to do it 8 times in a row. To give you a brief outline of what I would like to cover today, and I hope that our timekeeper will not be too rigorous with me. Oh, it's 16 minutes already. Oh, you didn't turn it off. That's good. I have nothing to guide me now.
It's moving down.
It's moving. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry you told me that. To give you a brief outline of what I would like to do. First of all, I'd like to talk about a visit to New Orleans that I made right after Katrina. And secondly, to review briefly some of the statements that we in the Catholic community have made. You are familiar with most of them, but there may be some who do not know them. And ultimately, to share with you some of the statements of the Catholic bishops of the United States, sometimes because of the hesitancy of our government to get on the bandwagon, as we say. You might think that there are no voices here in this country to shout out for the need for ecological honesty for the future. And so I'd like to show you how the American bishops have been very vigorously and publicly partisans of the preservation of the ecological balance of our world. And even within the past few months, they have launched a very important program to strive to bring the attention of our Catholic people in our own country, 60 million more of them, to face these problems, to see how they can be mitigated, if not even overcome. That basically would be the nature of my presentation. It tries to answer the question, can religion help to save the planet? Well, many of us say, yes, it can. Some of us feel that the planet cannot be saved without the help of religion, but only if it teaches, as you have here, O Holiness, clearly, courageously, and consistently. And that is what we must try to do. And my presentation points out some things that we are indeed trying to do. First of all, if I may, as a personal thing, just to reflect my own experience both here in the wake of Katrina and since then. His Eminence Cardinal Paul Cordes, the President of the Pontifical Council of Corunum, was sent by the Holy Father to the Gulf States region of our country shortly after Katrina to assess the damage and to bring both the prayerful sympathy of His Holiness and some generous gifts which the Holy Father sent to those who had suffered so much. Cardinal Cordes asked if I would accompany him on the journey, and I was happy to do so. The most memorable part of that was a helicopter journey over the ruins of the city. It was so soon after the terrible destruction that it was a that as we flew over the city, the stench of decay was still very present. And it was a terrible sign of the death and destruction that had taken place there. I remember that. I remember it because all your senses became filled with this terrible destruction. What you saw, the stench, what you heard, the eerie silence, and what you could almost feel in the eyes of the people whom you met afterwards. Inasmuch as these types of terrible destruction are multiplied in so many parts of the world, and here especially I think of the Philippines and the Pacific Islands in the past few weeks, we are called, all of us, to be more active and more concerned about the deeply changing nature of this environment and the desperate need we have to find a way to mitigate and correct it as much as is humanly possible. The renaissance of the city of New Orleans, which has taken so long to be realized and is still not completed, and the relics of its near death are still visible, and the fear of future calamity cannot totally be put aside. When we offend the laws of nature, the penalties are great and seemingly unavoidable. Religious leaders do have an obligation to speak out with clarity and forcefulness to their own people and to all men and women of goodwill throughout the world, not as scientists, which we are not, but as shepherds and pastors of souls. Patriarch Bartholomew has been making strong and clear calls for the world to become more aware of the encroaching problem of ecological change. For the Ecumenical Patriarch, it was no longer just an issue of environmental preservation, but, as I quote him now, insofar as it is human-induced, it is a profound moral and spiritual problem. End of quote. The evidence of human actions is painfully clear worldwide. Low-lying islands in the Pacific are already underwater. Hurricanes and typhoons of magnifying intensity and frequency wreak havoc along the coastlines of the world. The number of food emergencies in Africa each year has tripled since the 1980s, and as a result of drought and desertification. We were able to see this so clearly manifested in the Arctic, a truthful mirror of our own failures. As we watched with horror the destruction of so many lives and homes in the Pacific Basin a couple of weeks ago, the words of the bishops of New Zealand in September of 2006 haunt me. They wrote, "Our world is truly facing an ecological crisis which would equally be called an economic crisis or a poverty crisis. Its public face is the suffering of the poor and the degradation of our environment at a time when accumulation of wealth and material goods has never occupied our attention more. This is why we see it primarily as a spiritual or moral crisis." The end of that quote. The Catholic Church has raised its voice in the forum of international diplomacy. As a quotation from the Papal Nuncio to the United States, Archbishop Celestino Migliore, testifies when, back in 2005, the Archbishop spoke to the General Assembly in these words: "The numerous difficulties encountered in confronting the problems of global environmental degradation, such as climate change, drinking water shortage, deforestation, and desertification, show the complexity of facing the problems of development in a coherent, integrated way, and the need to replace fragmented sectoral approaches with a holistic and multi-sectored one." The bishops of the United States, and I want to spend the rest of my time talking about what we have tried to do here. The bishops of the United States, in an important document called Renewing the Earth, issued in 1991, spoke clearly in words that are still accurate today, 18 years later, and I quote them: "Our mistreatment of the natural world diminishes our own dignity and sacredness, not only because we are destroying resources that future generations of humans will need, but because we are engaging in actions that contradict what it means to be human. Our tradition calls us to protect the life and dignity of the human person, and it is increasingly clear that this task cannot be separated from the care and defense of all creation. For us Catholics and for so many other Christians, the Catechism remarks us that our creed begins with the creation of heaven and earth, for creation is the beginning and the foundation of all God's works. The Catechism goes on to remind us that man's dominion over inanimate and other living creatures granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. The Ecumenical Patriarch has spoken so many times on this, always consistently, always courageously, and always with great clarity. Pope Benedict XVI has echoed that. Another quote from him: "The environment is God's gift to everyone, and in our use of it, we have a responsibility toward the poor, toward future generations, and toward humanity as a whole." Pope John Paul, in his World Day of Peace message back in 1990, wrote, "The ecological crisis reveals the urgent moral need for new solidarity, especially in relations between the developing nations and those that are highly industrialized. States must increasingly share responsibility in complementary ways for the promotion of a natural and social environment that is both peaceful and healthy. I wish to repeat," the Holy Father said, "the ecological crisis is a moral issue." Again, to go back to the bishops of the United States to witness to the fact that we in this country have been aware, following the great examples of our Holy Fathers and of His Old Holiness and others who were courageous enough to bring this, not just in the field of science, but in the field of moral values, to the attention of all the world. Bishops of the United States produced another document called Global Climate Change, a plea for dialogue, prudence, and the common good. Here we find even more persuasive and positive language sent to all the people of the United States, and especially to the Catholic population. I quote it: "Because of the blessings God has bestowed on our nation and the power it possesses, the United States bears a special relationship, a special responsibility in its stewardship of God's creation to shape responses that serve the entire human family," unquote. Bishops again said, "True stewardship requires changes in human actions, both moral behavior and technical advancement. Our religious tradition has always urged restraint and moderation in the use of material goods. We must not allow our desire to possess more material things to overtake our concern for the basic needs of people and the environment. Changes in lifestyle, based on traditional moral values, can ease the way to a sustainable and equitable world economy in which sacrifice will no longer be an unpopular concept. A renewed sense of sacrifice and restraint could make an essential contribution to addressing global climate change." Back in 1993, again, the bishops in another document, an environmental justice program, invited Catholics to take this challenge to heart. Created to motivate Catholics to a deeper reverence and respect for God's creation, its hope was to encourage them to address environmental problems, particularly those which affect the poor and vulnerable people. In this matter, I'd like to call attention to the work of Catholic Relief Services, in which I'm privileged to serve as a member of the board. Through its international humanitarian relief and development programs, CRS is hoping and helping to strengthen the ability of the most vulnerable communities in the developing world, that they might respond to and prepare for the effects of climate change. CRS provides education and training to poor communities that reduce their vulnerability to climate impacts, such as floods and droughts and storms. In the United States also, a partnership of national Catholic organizations called the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change encourages a more thoughtful dialogue about ways the Catholic community can respond. We believe that a central moral measure of our response to climate change is how it touches poor and vulnerable people. Poor people cannot bear an undue burden of the global adjustments needed to address this problem. We believe that well-designed climate change policies can help both reduce the severity of climate change and protect the most vulnerable. We must ensure that the most useful technology is promptly made available to people in the most vulnerable developing countries to help them adapt to the effects of climate change and to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. It is essential, too, that we promote the participation of local communities in programs in adapting to climate change. We've tried to be realistic in our promotion of these important truths. In testimony before the Congress of the United States, our bishops have made it clear. The real inconvenient truth, we say, is that those who contribute least to climate change would be affected the most and have the least capacity to cope and to escape the face of climate change. Poor countries still have a basic right to develop sustainably, and people in these countries have a right to live with dignity and not in poverty. Finally, I would like to call attention to a very recent new development under the leadership of the immediate past president of our Bishops' Conference, who's known to Archbishop Demetrius, who, by the way, is a wonderful archbishop. Bishop Bill Skilstad of Yakima, who had been president of our Bishops' Conference. The bishop has been a leading voice in proclaiming this new Catholic climate covenant. The covenant includes a pledge named after St. Francis, the great apostle of nature and the environment, to protect creation and the poor. In a moving essay on the subject, Bishop Skilstad confirms the reasons and motivations of this covenant that is being offered to Catholics and all our neighbors. He says, in the United States, an increasing awareness of climate change and its intended issues is supported by public and private efforts to conserve energy. As our nation deliberates on future policies, American Catholics offer a distinctive position that compares and combines God's creation with protection for those who are poor and vulnerable. 2 years ago, His Holiness Pope Benedict wrote in a letter to Patriarch Bartholomew, a letter that I was privileged to read as we gathered in the Arctic Ocean, these words: with increasing clarity, scientific research demonstrates that the impact of human actions in any one place or region can have worldwide effects. This we heard this morning and very, very clearly analyzed for us. Pope Benedict's sophisticated understanding of all these issues is apparent in the same letter, where he discusses the responsibility that industrialized countries and those becoming more industrialized share. The bishop quotes the Holy Father, while it is true that industrializing countries are not morally free to repeat the past errors of others by recklessly continuing to damage the environment, it is also true of the case that highly industrialized countries must share clean technologies with these other countries and ensure that their markets do not sustain demands for goods whose very production contributes to the proliferation of pollution. As the bishops of our country more gravely reflected seriously on the problems of the environment, we wrote, at its core, global climate change is not simply about economic theory or political platforms, nor about partisan advantages or interest group pressures. Rather, global change is about the future of God's creation and one human family. It is about protecting both the human environment and the natural environment. It is about our human stewardship of God's creation and our responsibilities to those who come after us. When all is said and done, can religion help to save the planet? I truly believe it can, and I truly believe that under the leadership of great prophets like His All Holiness and those great scientists and men of religion, men and women of religion who are here at these meetings, this is something we need to try to do. Religion must demonstrate by its courage, its clarity, and its consistency what it believes, what it teaches, because that can be the answer to the problems we face. Thank you very much. 11 seconds.
Thank you so much, Cardinal McCarrick, for those very thoughtful words. And may the bishop's statements be truly moved into action in the future years.